Eve Carja, Tarkian, Trasnatir is Kush Ahis, Don Falcha Ara, Rof Galer Quig on Lake Show. Good evening and good morning, and welcome to Trasnatir. I'm Colin O'Rourke. I run the 1798 Rebellion Casualty Database page on Facebook. I'm deeply honoured to host this evening and this morning's talk. We are introducing Dr. Anne-Maree Whitaker. And I'm very, very honoured now to host this meeting because I'm a big fan. It's a very hard book to find, but it's a great, fantastic book, Unfinished Revolution. It's the story of the Irish that went out to Australia in the early 19th century, especially a lot of them were United Irishmen. So tonight we welcome Dr. Anne-Maree Whitaker. Anne-Maree is an independent historian based in Sydney, Australia, with a PhD in Australian history from Macquarie University, examining the United Irishmen transported to New South Wales in the period 1800 to 1810. Anne-Maree has written 10 books and numerous journal articles with a particular interest in Irish Australian and Australian Catholic topics. She is a fellow in the Royal Australian Historical Society and Royal Historical Society in the UK, and is a life member of the Irish National Association of Australasia. Some of Dr. Whitaker's publications include Unfinished Revolution, United Irishmen in New South Wales 1800 to 1810, and she's also written articles relating to Irish revolutionaries from the 1916 to 1923 period, particularly on people who settled in Australia. So tonight, let us all welcome Anne-Maree Whitaker to Trasnatir on this fantastic topic, Australia's Irish rebel history and the 1798 memorial. Over to you, Anne-Maree.
Thanks, Colin. The 1798, good start. The 1798 rebellion has been described as one of the most concentrated episodes of violence in Irish history, with a death toll estimated at 30,000. It grew from the seeds of the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789. It was the first nationally organised rebellion in Ireland and is generally considered as the commencement of the modern phase of Ireland's struggle for self-government. It is a mere footnote to the momentous events of the rebellion that 400 or more participants found themselves shipped to the distant thief colony of New South Wales, the first arriving on 2 ships in 1800. Some were relatively senior United Irishmen who had been charged before the outbreak of the Rising, many from Cork and others from the northern counties. Others had participated in the major theatres of the rebellion in Wexford, Wicklow, the Midlands and the North, but not necessarily with a prior political involvement with the United Irishmen or kindred organisations. Some examples. Neil Kerrigan claimed to have been the first man to shake the French General Humbert's hand when he landed in Mayo in September 1798. Michael Downes was reputedly the rebel captain responsible for the notorious massacre of loyalists at Scullabogue, County Wexford. Matthew Sutton, a barrister and United Irishman, had been a close aide of the commander of the Wexford rebels, Father Philip Roach. Joseph Holt had been the rebel general of the remnants of the Wexford forces when they retreated to Wicklow after the Battle of Vinegar Hill. The impact of the 1798 exiles on their destination was profound. In 1800, when the ships Minerva and Friendship arrived from Ireland, Sydney town was a 12-year-old settlement with a population of some 2,500, of whom 43% were convicts. The military were mainly concentrated in Sydney, with small garrisons at the other settlements at Parramatta, Toongabbie and the Hawkesbury. The economic viability of the colony was still very uncertain, with 1799 having seen the first of a disastrous series of floods at the Hawkesbury, which was the main crop-growing district. As late as 1813, ships were sent to India for emergency food supplies. More ships arrived from Ireland, the Anne in 1801, followed by the Atlas I, Atlas II, and Hercules in 1802. Each of them brought more veterans of the 1798 rebellion and more news of continuing unrest in the Irish countryside. On Sunday, the 22nd of January 1804, a whaling ship arrived in Sydney, the Ferret, 5 months out of London, with newspapers as recent as the 22nd of August the previous year. These brought the first reports of a new rising in Dublin led by Robert Emmet. Needless to say, the news spread through the colony like wildfire. Exactly 6 weeks after New South Wales first heard of Emmet's failed insurrection, on Sunday the 4th of March 1804, the Irish convicts at Castle Hill outside Sydney staged a rebellion. The rebels' plan was to move to the Hawkesbury district and conduct further arms raids over the next few days before turning to attack Parramatta, then Sydney, and seize ships to escape and return to Ireland. However, the New South Wales Corps set out in hot pursuit of the rebels, and 55 soldiers led by Major George Johnson arrived at Parramatta at dawn the next day. After a forced march through the night, the troops now faced a pursuit on a day which was intensely hot. Johnson rode ahead while the main party proceeded on foot. After a chase of 16 kilometres, Johnson finally received word that the rebels were less than 2 kilometres ahead. It was about 10:30 a.m. on Monday, the 5th of March. Now, this is what I call contemporary film footage of the event. As you can see, there's a lot of things happening here. This is an original painting from about that time or soon after. Rebels on the right, the little line of soldiers on the left, and in the middle on the chestnut horse is Major Johnson, and on the black horse is the trooper. And if you look really hard at the back left, you can see there's gallows with bodies hanging. So it's like a sort of a time span of a whole series of things that happened at different times put together in one picture. So that's really famous picture in early Australian history, that one. So Johnson galloped after the rebels and asked to speak to their leaders. The estimated rebel force of 266 called to him to come among them. He replied he was within pistol shot, so was no threat, and their commander should come out and speak to him. Eventually, after some delay, Philip Cunningham and William Johnson advanced from the rebel lines. Major Johnston told them he wanted to avoid bloodshed, and their response was a modification of the usual slogan, death or liberty, and a ship to take us home. Major Johnson rode back to the advancing troops, and the rebels formed into a line on the second hill this side of the last halfway pond under the command of William Johnson and Philip Cunningham. Now we'll go into a detail of this marvellous picture. So Major Johnson and his mounted trooper galloped back to the rebels, and at that moment the soldiers came into view. With the rebels distracted, Major Johnson produced a pistol he had concealed in his sash and clapped it to the head of one of the rebel leaders, telling him he would blow his soul to hell. The trooper did the same to the other. Retreating with his captives, Johnson ordered the troops to open fire and charge. Firing commenced on both sides, although the rebels offered little resistance and soon scattered and ran. In the initial stages, 9 rebels were killed at the last pond, many wounded, and 7 prisoners taken. Soon after, 3 more were killed and another 19 captured. There was no report of any deaths or injuries among the soldiers and their volunteer supporters. The rebels were pursued in all directions until an excessive dark night fell. This brief but bloody battle became known as the Battle of Vinegar Hill, after the battle of the same name, which was the culmination of the 1798 rebellion. By and large, however, the more prominent United Irishmen remained somewhat detached from the Castle Hill rebellion and the deposition of Governor Bligh by Major Johnson 4 years later. Some of the Irish political prisoners chose to return home when the opportunity arose. Joseph Holt, the Wicklow general, left in 1812. Matthew Sutton, one of Father Roach's lieutenants, left in 1809, after some years employed as a magistrate's clerk. The 3 Catholic priests, James Harold, James Dixon, and Peter O'Neill, left in their turn. As they raised their families, the shadows of the United Irishmen loomed long over 19th century Australia. It is perhaps tempting to overemphasize the role of the United Irishmen and their descendants in the shaping of Australian history. After all, they were followed by other political agitators, some as convicts like the Young Irelanders of 1848 and the Fenians of the 1860s, and others as free emigrants. As historian Oliver McDonough has said, an unsung army of men and women who learned methods of political agitation and organisation in the constitutional movements of 19th century Ireland also played their part in building Australian political institutions. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that the introduction of political debate and agitation to New South Wales with the United Irishmen in 1800 and their integration into the society and institutions of the colony during the following decades were significant. The inheritance which the United Irishmen brought was the struggle for religious toleration, for equality in the political and legal systems, for land tenure, and for the right to regulate their own lives. Their legacy can be found in the recognition of nonconformist denominations and Catholicism, in incisive criticism of colonial rule and institutions, in the spread of settlement and the rule of law, and in specific colonial political movements such as the Emancipists of the 1820s and the Anti-Transportation League of the 1840s and 1850s. If, in the process, they laid down their weapons and beat their swords into ploughshares, it may be that their militancy was not so much tamed as redirected, as will be seen from examining some prominent examples. William Redfern was a naval surgeon at the time of the British mutiny at the Nore and Spithead in 1797. As the United Irishmen were heavily involved in the organisation and carrying out of these revolts, it is possible but not certain that he was a member, and his brother Robert was indeed a prominent United Irishman in Belfast. William's colonial career certainly confirmed that his views were on the radical end of the political spectrum. Redfern's medical qualifications earned him appointment as surgeon on Norfolk Island shortly after his arrival in 1802. By 1808, he was back in Sydney and was appointed assistant surgeon, a position he continued to hold during Lachlan Macquarie's governorship from 1810 to 1821. Redfern played a significant role in reforming the conditions on convict ships following his inquiry into mortality on 2 ships in 1814. His report has been described as one of the major Australian contributions to public health. He was appointed a magistrate by Macquarie in 1819, but the appointment was revoked by London, who did not approve of ex-convicts being allowed to sit on the bench. Perhaps Redfern's most important contribution to New South Wales history was his role in the passage of the New South Wales Act of 1823. A British court in 1817 ruled that all colonially issued pardons had been invalid due to a technicality. This effectively meant that property ownership and the right to take civil court action were denied to many of the wealthiest settlers in the colony because they were ex-convicts. An Emancipated Colonists Committee was set up with Governor Macquarie's approval and encouragement to lobby for this potentially disastrous situation to be resolved. Redfern and another Irish emancipist attorney, Edward Eager, travelled to London to mount the campaign. Their arrival coincided with the consideration of a bill to establish a Supreme Court in New South Wales and the post of Chief Justice. So it was decided to lobby for amending clauses to this proposed legislation. Another issue of deep concern to the political campaigners was trial by jury, which had been denied until then. When the legislation finally had its third reading in the House of Commons in July 1823, after a week of intense behind-the-scenes lobbying for and against, the emancipation issue was satisfactorily resolved, but trial by jury was not permitted. Redfern returned to Sydney, and when he died in Edinburgh in 1833, while supervising his son's medical education, his estates in New South Wales totalled over 23,000 acres. James Meehan was a United Irishman from Shinrone, County Offaly, who had been both a schoolteacher and a surveyor before his transportation. I'll just pause there. Transportation's the term they use for sending someone out as a convict. It's not just, the sort of meaning that it has perhaps in America or even in Ireland. So when I say transportation or transportee, I'm actually referring to people sent out as convicts. His experience as a surveyor was to prove crucial to his colonial career, as he was appointed to assist the Surveyor General Charles Grimes on arrival, and when Grimes returned to England, Meehan found himself shouldering most of the burden of the post. It was 5 or 6 years before the arrival of the next Surveyor General, John Oxley, and he had no technical qualifications and spent most of his time exploring. Meehan also did his share of exploration, visiting Port Phillip, now Melbourne, with Grimes in 1803, discovering the overland route to Jervis Bay in 1817, and teaching the rudiments of both exploration and surveying to the colonial-born Hamilton Hume, who went on to trailblaze the overland route to Port Phillip. When Hume and his fellow explorer William Hobble quarrelled over whether they had reached Western Port or Port Phillip, Hume quoted Meehan's description of the two bays to justify his certainty that it was indeed Port Phillip. While Meehan was busily engaged in measuring farms and laying out town plans for Liverpool, Windsor, Hobart, Port Macquarie and Bathurst, among others, he also acquired extensive pastoral property in the Goulburn district, which he had explored and named. He entrusted the management of this interest to Ned Ryan, a political transportee from Tipperary, who arrived in New South Wales in 1816. And Ned Ryan been the subject of many books and a lot of interest here, but he was actually sent out with a group for what is called the Bala Barracks riots in Tipperary, where a group of villagers burnt down a building that was proposed to be turned into a police barracks. So that's quite a famous event in that part of Tipperary, and that was the group that Ned Ryan was part of. He later moved on to Burrawa and Geelong, and his colonial career has been the subject of several studies, as I mentioned. James Meehan retired from the post of Deputy Surveyor, which Macquarie had created especially for him in 1823. He had been an active member of the Emancipated Colonists Committee, along with Redfern and Eager, and when he died in 1826, left substantial land holdings. Richard Dwyer was a Protestant woolen draper and senior figure in the Defenders and later the United Irishmen in Cork City. He arrived in Sydney on the Minerva in 1800 and in 1807 was appointed storekeeper in Launceston, which is in Tasmania. Dwyer was appointed to the trusted post of Commissariat Clerk in 1817, but resigned his office to concentrate on agriculture. His property, Quamby, was built in the full style of an Irish manor house, surrounded by 12 acres of grounds containing hothouses, pheasant houses, and a deer park. By 1827, he owned some 12,000 acres in the Westbury district. He had become a respected citizen of Launceston, being Assistant Secretary of the British and Foreign Bible Society in 1823, a founder of the Cornwall Bank in 1828, and of the Tamar Steam Navigation Company in 1837. By the time of Dryer's death in 1843, his son and namesake inherited 30,000 acres. The younger Dwyer threw himself energetically into politics, particularly the campaigns for representative government and against transportation, meaning the shipment of convicts from Britain. He had evidently learnt thoroughly his father's democratic political principles and was one of the so-called Patriotic Six in the Legislative Council, who defied the governor over his use of both deliberative and casting votes to force through his programme. Richard Dwyer Jr. was later Premier of Tasmania, and in 1858 was the first Australian-born man to receive a British knighthood. James Dempsey was court-martialled in December 1799 for murdering 2 yeomen at Carnew shortly after the Battle of Vinegar Hill, and 2 members of the ancient Britain's Fencible Regiment at or after the Battle of Ballyellis. He was a stonemason by trade and probably a native of Wicklow. He arrived in Sydney on the Atlas II in 1802, and his trade skills found him soon employed on government building projects. By 1806, he was working on construction of the Dawes Point Battery, In the same year, Dempsey was appointed overseer of the stonemasons. After receiving his absolute pardon in 1809, Dempsey worked on the Tank Stream Bridge in 1811 and was overseer of stonemasons building the new hospital, now the Mint Building, from 1812 to 1815. During the presence of Father Jeremiah O'Flynn in Sydney in 1817 to 18, Dempsey's house in the Rocks district was one of the sites where gatherings were held to say prayers. Tradition indicates he was a Carmelite tertiary and therefore regarded with some esteem by the laity in a priestless colony. With his religious belief and his building expertise, it is not surprising that Dempsey played a significant role in the construction of the first St Mary's Cathedral, which you see on the slide. His house also became a mass centre after the arrival in Sydney of the first Catholic chaplains in 1820, and Dempsey was a member of the original fundraising committee and a generous donor to the project, giving well over £200 in the first 3 or 4 years. From the beginning, he was superintendent of construction and at times virtually ad hoc architect, but progress was slow. By 1824, only the outer walls had been completed, and it was estimated that another £3,000 was necessary to finish the ambitiously large church. Towards the end of 1825, it was decided to send James Dempsey to India to solicit funds. It was a disappointing trip, as the local church authorities in India did not welcome an appeal from such a distant mission in competition with their own fundraising, and he returned to Sydney the following year. Dempsey visited Ireland in 1828, returning to Sydney after several years to attend the first Mass celebrated in St Mary's at Christmas 1833. He was remembered by a younger contemporary for his fond claim that, quote, "Nothing on earth gave him so much pleasure as to have it in his power to oblige a Catholic, more especially if that Catholic should happen to be a United Irishman." End quote. James Dempsey died in 1838 and was buried from St Mary's Cathedral in the Sandhill Cemetery on the modern site of Sydney's Central Railway Station. Between 1849 and 1850, 15 Irish political activists known as the Young Irelanders were sent as convicts to Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania. Best known among them were John Mitchell, William Smith O'Brien, and Thomas Marr. Marr and Mitchell both managed to escape and emigrate to the United States in the early 1850s. They served on opposite sides of the American Civil War, Marr serving with the Union, for which he recruited and commanded the Irish Brigade, and Mitchell allying himself with the Confederacy. In 1854, after 5 years in Tasmania, William Smith O'Brien was released on the condition he never returned to the United Kingdom. He settled in Brussels in May 1856 when he was granted an unconditional pardon and returned to Ireland. He contributed to the Nation newspaper and published the 2-volume Principles of Government or Meditations in Exile in 1856, but played no further part in politics. Unlike most of the other Young Ireland transportees, Kevin O'Doherty chose to remain in Australia. In June 1853, he received a conditional pardon, which forbade residence in the United Kingdom, and he went to live in Paris. He received an unconditional pardon next year and returned to Dublin, where he graduated as a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in June 1857. O'Doherty returned to Victoria in 1860 and later settled in Brisbane, where he became a leading physician. He was one of the first presidents of the Queensland Medical Society and carried out extensive honorary work at Catholic hospitals. A member for Brisbane in the Legislative Assembly in 1867 to 73, he had wide interests. In 1872, he was responsible for the first Health Act in Queensland, and in 1875 to 77, gave evidence to many commissions on medical matters. He was a member of the Legislative Council from 1877 to 85 and sponsored a bill to stop the traffic in indentured labour, known as South Sea Islanders. A leading figure in the Queensland Irish Association, he was elected president of the Irish Australian Convention held in Melbourne in 1883. and that's his grave in Brisbane. It's a very fine monument, as you can see. Kevin is O'Doherty, the Irish patriot, whose name will live in Irish history and whose memory even ever remains enshrined in Irish hearts at home and abroad, and his gifted wife, Eva of the Nation. He was a famous poet. I'm sure everyone has heard of Eva. Other prominent young Ireland figures came to Australia voluntarily to pursue political careers. Charles Gavan Duffy was elected to the Victorian Parliament in 1856 on a platform of land reform. The following year, John O'Shannessy unexpectedly became Premier. Duffy was his deputy, as well as Commissioner for Public Works, President of the Board of Land and Works, and Commissioner for Crown Lands and Survey. Duffy's Land Act was passed in 1862. It provided for new and extended pastoral licenses in an effort to break the landholding monopoly of the so-called squatter class. However, the bill had been amended into ineffectiveness by the Legislative Council, so that it was easy for the squatters to extend their control. Duffy's attempts to correct the legislation were defeated. Historian Don Garden commented that, quote, "Unfortunately, Duffy's dreams were on a higher plane than his practical skills as a legislator and the morals of those who opposed him," end quote. But Duffy's son, Frank Gavan Duffy, later became the Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia. Edward Butler was appointed to the New South Wales Parliament in 1861 and served through a tumultuous period, including the attempted assassination of Prince Alfred by alleged Fenian Henry O'Farrell. More than anyone, Butler nullified the bitter sectarianism that flared after the O'Farrell incident. As his biographer Bede Nairn said, Butler's whole career exemplified tolerance and gave practical proof that Catholics could accept and nurture democracy. He showed that Catholicism was not antagonistic to learning or urbanity or a sense of fun, and that being an Irishman was subversive neither of colony nor the legal profession. He injected a radical note into his profession's conservatism and helped to open the law to talent unaided by birth or influence. In 1868, the last convict ship to arrive in Australia brought 62 political prisoners transported for their part in the Fenian Rising of 1867. In 1869, pardons were issued to many of the imprisoned Fenians. Another round of pardons was issued in 1871, after which only a small group of military Fenians remained in Western Australia's penal system. In 1874, one of them managed to smuggle out a letter to America, where it came into the hands of John Boyle O'Reilly, who had escaped earlier. He mounted a rescue operation of 6 of the Fenians in the ship Catalpa. Other Fenian prisoners chose to remain in Australia and pursued careers in journalism and the law. Hugh Brophy and Cornelius O'Mahony are buried back to back in Melbourne General Cemetery, while John Flood lies in Gympie Cemetery in central Queensland. And both Brophy and O'Mahony have on their tombstones "released political prisoner." They have the same wording on their graves, and you can see the 2 crosses and this middle photo. They're actually back to back in adjoining rows. Returning to the United Irishmen, the last group of 1798 rebels to be sent to New South Wales arrived in February 1806. They were Michael Dwyer and 4 of his Wicklow lieutenants and another group of 3 from Carlow. All had evaded capture for at least 5 years and were therefore seasoned guerrilla fighters. Treated as a free settler, Dwyer was given a grant of 100 acres of land on Cabramatta Creek in Sydney. Falling foul of the notorious Governor Bligh, Dwyer was charged on the 11th of May 1807 with conspiring to mount an insurrection. He was found not guilty, but Governor Bligh disregarded the acquittal and ordered a second trial in which Dwyer was stripped of his free settler status and sent to Van Diemen's Land and later to Norfolk Island. After Governor Bligh was overthrown in 1808, the new Governor of New South Wales, George Johnson, who was one of the judges at Dwyer's acquittal in the first trial, ordered that his freedom be reinstated. Dwyer was later to become Chief Constable from 1813 to 1820 at Liverpool, New South Wales, but was dismissed for drunken conduct and mislaying important documents. Bankrupted, he was forced to sell off most of his assets, which included a tavern called the Harrow Inn, named after the famous battle in Wexford in 1798. This did not save him from several weeks' incarceration in the Sydney debtors' prison, where he contracted dysentery and died in August 1825. Dwyer's widow, Mary, lived to the age of 95 and died in 1860, when she was buried with her husband in Sydney's Sandhill Cemetery. In the 1890s, it was announced that the cemetery was to be removed for the construction of a new central railway station, and plans began to construct a lasting monument to the Irish patriots of 1798, with the Dwyers reinterred beneath it. By 1898, the Dwyer legend had become so potent that the removal of his remains to the site of the 1798 memorial at Waverly Cemetery attracted the largest gathering of any 1798 centenary event in the world. At least 200,000 people lined the route from St Mary's Cathedral in the city out to Waverly Cemetery, when the Dwyer's remains were moved in procession to their new burial site. I have to have a picture of the Opera House there so everyone knows we're in Sydney, but it's not really relevant because it wasn't there at the time. Waverly Cemetery, however, is about 6.5 kilometres southeast of the Opera House, the centre of Sydney, and it appealed to the organisers because it was an interdenominational cemetery which reflected the 1798 rebellion's support for religious tolerance and the inclusion of Protestants, Catholics and dissenters among its organisers and supporters. With its clifftop site overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Waverly Cemetery was also a very picturesque setting. The architect commissioned to design the memorial was John Hennessy of Sheeran and Hennessy, who also designed many Catholic churches and schools around Sydney. The architect's brief called for, quote, a monument in Irish architecture, unquote, to the memory of the 1798 rebels. The reflective qualities of the white Carrara marble make the memorial appear even larger than it actually is and give it a shimmering aura in sunlight. The reinterment of Michael Dwyer below the memorial elevated it from simple posthumous reverence to a degree of sanctity akin to a tomb of the unknown warrior. No other 1798 centennial monument in the world was contrived to fulfill this dual function of gravesite and war memorial. Clearly, the design was also heavily influenced by the chairman of the organising committee, Dr. Charles McCarthy, who was an award-winning sculptor, painter, musician and writer. Charles William McCarthy was born in Fethard, County Tipperary, and gained medical qualifications before going to Australia in 1884. He was immediately appointed to the staff at St Vincent's Hospital, where he remained for nearly 30 years. He died in 1919 and is buried overlooking the memorial. The base of the memorial is 30 feet wide and 24 feet deep. The back wall rises 10 feet above the ground and the height of the cross is 30 feet. The main material is Carrara marble. Commemorations are conducted inside the memorial, which effectively forms a church sanctuary or stage, while onlookers gather on the surrounding driveways and paths. Now there's three views of it. There's a big long driveway looking towards it. You can see it in the far distance. The lower one is the view in the opposite direction from behind the memorial, and then a side-on view where you can see the ocean in the distance. The memorial is located in the centre of Waverly Cemetery, facing north at the end of a 200-metre main driveway. The cemetery has perimeter plantings of Norfolk Island pines, while the main trees within the cemetery are Canary Island date palms. The 6-metre wide clear space around the memorial was purchased in the 1970s to ensure that the memorial was not crowded in by other graves and vaults. Restoration and repair has continued since the memorial was completed. The elaborately carved cross rises 30 feet or 9 metres. On the base are the words "In loving memory of all who dared and suffered for Ireland in 1798." Above this, the words "Remember 98" are decorated with intertwining shamrocks and sprigs of laurel. The cross itself is carved with interlacing designs in the style of ornamentation in old Irish manuscripts such as the Book of Kells. The monument was constructed by local monumental masons Ross and Bowman. The cross is modelled on high crosses in Ireland, but is larger than any of them. The high cross in Ireland which comes closest to this style is the South Cross at Aheny, County Tipperary, which is about 3.6 metres high. The tallest Irish high cross is the West Cross at Monasterboice, County Louth, which is 6.4 metres. So this cross we're looking at is 9 metres. The Irish Wolfhound is a very large breed of dog once used for hunting wolves and deer. It is unique to Ireland, but was prized throughout Europe. In the 4th century AD, there is reference to 7 Irish dogs, probably wolfhounds, being sent to Rome for solemn shows and games. The wolfhounds are on either side of the front wall. They were cast at Castle Brothers Foundry in Newtown, Sydney. In January 1966, they were stolen and the heads cut off. They were recovered from a scrap metal dealer 2 months later and reinstalled at the memorial. The rings where the heads were sawn off are still visible, and the Conservatives resisted filing away these marks, as the theft and reinstatement are part of the history of the memorial. And you'll notice there also we have quotes from The Memory of the Dead by John Kells Ingram, who fears to speak of 98, who blushes at the name, when cowards mock the patriot's fate, who hangs his head in shame. The bronze fence was added to the front of the memorial in 1927. It was designed by John Hennessy and constructed by Castle Brothers Foundry. The centre section has 3 panels, one of which, bearing an ornamental shield, forms the entrance gate, and that's the lower picture you can see there. The panels on either side of the gate each bear a harp and rising sun motif with intertwined snakes below, and that's the upper picture you can see. The harp was the emblem of the 1798 rebellion with the motto, "It is new strung and shall be heard." The mosaics on the floor of the monument were made by artisans from Anthony Horden's, a prominent Sydney department store. The centre section, which you can see in the lower picture, contains a blue-green harp with a female figure forming one side. The 3-leaf shamrock, green shamrocks are strewn around on a gold background. The shamrock was used by the missionary St. Patrick to demonstrate the doctrine of the Trinity to the Irish converts to Christianity. On either side of this central field are identical sections depicting a thatched cottage and a round tower. You can see that in the upper picture. There are over 100 round towers surviving in Ireland. They were built from the 7th century, primarily as bell towers of monasteries. In times of danger, such as Viking invasions, the round towers were used by the monks as places of refuge and lookouts. These particularly Irish symbols are typical of the Celtic revival movement of the late 19th century, and the Waverly mosaics have been described as, quote, one of the 3 most strikingly original creations of the Celtic revival in the world. On the western side of the memorial is an inscription in the Ogham alphabet, or Ogham as it's pronounced in modern Irish. This indicates letters by groups of lines above, below, or across a stem line. There are over 300 Ogham inscriptions in Ireland which date back to early Christian times. This inscription reads, "The bright days of ancient Ireland will dawn once more." Above this, not shown in this photograph, is another inscription in Gaelic which translates as, "May God free Ireland." On the east side of the memorial, facing the sea and the rising sun, is an inscription in Irish Gaelic. This translates as, "People of Ireland, treasure the memory of the deeds of your ancestors. The warriors die, but the true cause lasts forever." Bronze medallions across the rear wall were designed and made by Dr. McCarthy. The round plaques depict rebellion leaders Wolfe Tone, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, Michael Dwyer, and Robert Emmet. The rectangular plaques depict the arrest of Lord Edward and the Battle of Ullart Hill. Two other medallions on the shaft of the cross, which are not shown, depict rebellion leaders Henry Joy McCracken of Belfast and Father John Murphy of Wexford. On the memorial's rear wall are inscribed the names of 78 leaders and prominent figures in the 1798 rebellion. Interestingly, only two of them, Michael Dwyer and Joseph Holt, were among those transported to New South Wales. The list includes three women, Mary McCracken, Betsy Gray, and Anne Devlin. It also includes Catholic priests, Presbyterian ministers, and clergymen of the Church of Ireland to emphasise the ecumenical nature of the rebellion. After the first two names is a gap surrounded by quote marks. This represents Robert Emmet, who in his much publicised trial speech requested, "Let my tomb remain uninscribed until my country has taken her place among the nations of the earth. Then, and not till then, let my epitaph be written." Below these names, a further inscription was added in 1947, listing 17 leaders of the 1916 Easter Rising. And in case anyone's wondering, there were 16 men executed after the Rising. The 17th name is the O'Reilly, who died in Moore Street. In 1994, a plaque was added behind the memorial, but separate from it, commemorating the 1981 hunger strikers. 10 IRA and INLA prisoners, led by Bobby Sands, died in this protest against the removal of political status. The plaque is white Carrara marble, like the memorial itself, and was designed by prisoners in the H blocks and made by Ace Monumentals of Lidcombe, Sydney. Even though the 1798 memorial was to an earlier Irish rebellion, its size and ornate decoration made it a fitting site for Irish political commemorations throughout the 20th century. In 1927, the fence and gates, decorated with martial symbols such as spears, axes, and a shield, were installed at the memorial. One of the first reported Easter Rising commemorations at the 1798 memorial was held in 1930 by the Irish National Association. The INA commemoration is normally held on Easter Sunday at 3 p.m. and has continued in various forms to the present day. Born in Dublin in 1898, May Gahan was in Stephen's Green at the start of the Easter Rising in 1916. She acted as a courier throughout the rebellion and was subsequently imprisoned. Continuing her military service through the War of Independence, May was imprisoned again in 1923. She married John O'Carroll in 1917 and they emigrated to Australia in 1929. May had 10 children and was granted an Irish government service pension as, quote, "a mother who devoted the best young years of her life to her country," end quote. May's daughter Maureen recalled that each Easter Sunday the children would be loaded on the back of a truck and driven to Waverly. They brought with them a laurel wreath decorated with green, white, and gold satin ribbons, and as dawn broke, they would lay the wreath on the memorial while one of Maureen's brothers played the last post on a bugle. This photograph shows May at the memorial in the 1930s. She attended Easter commemorations there wearing her Irish service medals until shortly before her death in 1988. I can remember May. We used to regard her with complete awe. She'd turn up and they'd produce a folding chair so she could sit down while the ceremonies were taking place and not have to stand like everyone else. And the medals were there, and it was really quite inspiring to have somebody who had that connection so many years after the event. Until the 1960s, ceremonies were held on Easter Sunday, including a procession from the cemetery gates, the recitation of the Rosary in Irish, wreath laying, and speeches. In 1966, the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, the first Mass was celebrated. This tradition has continued to the present day with speeches following the Mass. The 1916 proclamation is read and an oration presented by an invited speaker. And the tall figure you see right in the middle there underneath the canopy is Father Michael O'Sullivan, who is, wrote a very comprehensive history and description of the memorial under his pseudonym of Antahami Hall, but we all knew it was him. And then on the right behind the wolfhound in the background is Bishop David Cumann, who was said the first mass in 1966 and still going. With the exception of Mary Robinson and Michael D. Higgins, every Irish president and prime minister to visit Sydney has laid a wreath at the 1798 memorial. Former and future Prime Minister Eamon de Valera visited the memorial in 1948 on the 150th anniversary of the 1798 rebellion. It was the year after the 1916 rising names had been added to the back of the memorial, a rebellion in which de Valera himself, of course, had participated. A later visitor in 1985 was President Patrick Hillary. He laid a wreath at the memorial and, like most visitors from Ireland, was surprised at its size and ornamentation. Irish President Mary McAleese visited the memorial in 1998, which was the 200th anniversary of the Rising, and in her speech stated, "We have come to this sacred place to assert that our history matters and that we honour those who have been here before us and that their experience can enable us to understand ourselves." The following year, Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams visited the memorial, displaying particular interest naturally in the hunger strikers plaque. Adams had served time in prison with Bobby Sands and several of the other hunger strikers. And you see in the photograph there, he's with Father Michael O'Sullivan, who was giving him the expert's guided tour to the whole monument. Sydney's centennial commemoration of the Easter Rising in 2016 was organised by the Irish National Association and held at the memorial. The event included a formal procession from the cemetery gates, a mass celebrated by Bishops David Cumann and Terry Brady, speakers including the Irish Consul General Jane Connolly and the Sinn Féin MP for West Belfast Paul Maskey. The main oration was given by former New South Wales Public Service Association office bearer and Gaeilgeoir Maurice O'Hulawan. The proclamation of the Irish Republic, first read by Patrick Pearse outside the GPO at the start of the Rising, was read out on this occasion by Sean O'Connor, who also read it 60 years earlier at the 1956 Waverly commemoration. The INA wreath was laid by May O'Carroll's son, Sean Houston O'Carroll, 70 years after he had previously performed this task, and on this occasion he was joined by Cormac Smythe, whose grandfather Paddy Mahan was a sniper on the roof of the GPO during the Rising. Now here we are back to the original slide, and I'm just going to break in here to read a poem, a very famous poem it's called The Irish Memorial Waverly, and it's by Mary Gilmore, who is one of the best known Australian poets and whose picture appears on the Australian $10 banknote. The sun shines on the tomb where the hounds of Erin couch. O vast the room, their spirits to avouch. Though scattered bones lie far, they followed Erin's star. Be theirs the memory of prayer, the dead who living are. The round tower points above by the cabin and the hill, though both the harper love can touch our spirits still. The shamrock carried wide floats in on every tide. Pray for the souls of Michael Dwyer, Mary his wife beside. The white gulls whirl and cry where the hounds of Erin couch. Calm in their rest they lie, who know not how to crouch. One in their patriot creed, one in their sacred need. Catholic, Protestant, name them there, one in the falling bead. Shine, sun, upon the tomb where the hounds of Erin couch. Thou of the vaster room, give them thine own avouch. So here we are back at the introductory slide to remind you of the memorial's appearance before the cleaning of the medallions and repairs to the fence early in 2020. general weathering and particularly the sea air do take their toll. The memorial has been conserved and repaired several times during its history, including underpinning to prevent it from shifting and cracking. In 2020, the focus was on cleaning the bronze medallions and the fence. So that's what it looks like now. You can see the medallions look much darker and prominent. As you can see, the bronze is looking much better and the fence has been repaired where parts had broken off. And there are the rectangular plaques, the arrest of Lord Edward and the Battle of Ullart Hill. And there are the portrait plaques with a bit of shadow there because you can never get the time of day when everything is perfect for taking photos. Robert Emmet, Michael Dwyer, Lord Edward Fitzgerald and Wolfe Tone, I think, wasn't it? Yes. So this work means that this magnificent memorial is handed on to the next generation in good condition for their stewardship of the legacy in 1798 in Australia. Thank you. That's it.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Anne-Maree, for this. That was amazing to see Irish Australian history just summed up in an hour. It was fascinating. We didn't even get too many questions. It was just everybody just saying how great it is, you know. I'm just going to have a quick scroll back here now on the question on the comments, and I believe there were several here about the poet of that poem you just read out. Can you name the poet again, Anne-Maree?
Yes, it's Mary Gilmore. She's a Scottish background actually. She was a Cameron and then she married a Gilmore, Gilmore. It's not one of her most famous poems, but she certainly is a very well-known Australian poet. And as I say, her picture's on the $10 note, so that kind of means that everybody handling Mary Gilmore's portrait every time they go into a shop.
I have a question here from Stephen McCracken, who would be distantly related to Henry Joy McCracken, the United Irish leader. Mm-hmm. Was there any pushback by the locals against commemorations in form of any protests, as in the Unionist or loyal Orange lodges in Australia? Was there any backlash towards from them against the Irish nationalists celebrating at the Dwyer Memorial?
I haven't heard of any, and it's probably because it's not in a public area in the sense that it's not in the middle of the city or in a public street. It wouldn't necessarily have attracted as much attention because you had to know to go to the cemetery and go down to the memorial to even know it was happening. No, I haven't heard of it. I imagine they probably didn't think much in the local area of the bugle sounding at dawn, but other than that, I haven't heard of anything like that.
I have a question here from Fergus Carey. Is there a memorial to Archbishop Mannix in Australia?
Oh, I think the whole country's a memorial to Archbishop Mannix. Mannix was from he was the Archbishop of Melbourne, and I'm just trying to think now. That's a tricky one. I think he's buried in St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne. Now, I showed you that picture of the statue of Daniel O'Connell outside St Patrick's Cathedral. And that was, Mannix was there from the 1910s, and he lived to the 1960s, and I think he was 99 or something when he died, and had previously been the president of Maynooth, and an amazing career. And the most famous thing I think that happened with Mannix was when he was trying to get back to Ireland in the 1920s, when his mother was actually dying, by ship, obviously, in those days. And the British Navy came and turned the ship around and wouldn't let the ship go to Ireland because Mannix was on it. And his comment was, the most significant victory for the Royal Navy since the Battle of Jutland. He was very good at the sarcastic remarks. He had a great wit, the Archbishop Mannix. But yes, I'm pretty sure that there are memorials in Melbourne, and I think there is, in fact, inside St Patrick's Cathedral, a monument to him, but I don't have that in this presentation, sorry.
Okay, that's no problem. We've had just everybody who's writing in. This is awesome, great talk, very moving. We have from Michelle. She was at the monument on Easter Sunday, 1994, when the Hunger Strikers monument was unveiled.
All right.
Andrew, we have Andrew Redfern, who was a descendant of William Redfern. You tuned in tonight. We also have Dr. William Redfern is my fourth great uncle from Melissa. So we had a bit of a Redfern family gathering here tonight.
Yeah.
Which is great to see. And we have just fantastic comments from everybody. Everybody seemed to have enjoyed the talk. And was also a reminder as well that there's a talk on one of the hunger strikers on November 11th. There's a talk about Bobby Sands. It's not so much about his activities leading up to his imprisonment, but it's actually a Bobby Sands, the man. It's an interview with his cellmate, Colin Scully, and so we're trying to grasp what Bobby Sands was like as a person, not so much about what we know of him. So that's on November the 11th. Also now we have Keno O'Huluan from Clonakilty, West Cork. He was at the memorial twice since the year 2000, and he placed an Easter lily at it on one of those visits. Thanks for organising this. We have Diarmuid Breathnach. Probably not mentioned is the poem by Bobby Sands about deportation to the penal colony of the United Irishmen in 1803. He was made famous by the artist Christy Moore, and it's known as Back Home in Derry.
Yeah, I was tempted to try and put some music in, but I thought it would be too complicated, so I didn't. But yeah, that's a very famous song.
Yeah, it's a good song. What else now? We have just still more people just commenting saying very, very well done. We got a question here from Sarah. How fluent in Irish were most of the rebels that went out? Was there any evidence of them attempting to pass down the Gaelic culture?
A lot of them were Irish speakers, probably less so the people from places like Wicklow, but certainly the people from the west and the south of the country. Like Philip Cunningham, who was the leader of the Castle Hill Rebellion that I talked about, he was actually from Kerry, so he would have been a native speaker, definitely. It certainly does seem to have been passed. The Gaelic culture was passed down through the 19th century, but I'm afraid after 200 years or so, it kind of gets weakened by the introduction of people from other cultures. Like there were immigrants in Australia in the old days, from Germany and other parts of Europe, as well as from England. And of course nowadays we've got television to ruin everyone's attempts to preserve their own cultures and not be overwhelmed by the United States and all of that kind of television culture. But yeah, there certainly was, and in fact, going well even into the 1920s, there were parts of New South Wales and Victoria where people actually still spoke Gaelic, but it doesn't seem to have continued on to the present.
Yeah. We have a question here again from Keno Huluan. He goes, a lot of the rebels were transported and subsequently became successful in politics and business in Australia afterwards. He finds it fascinating that while they remained Irish Republicans, did they have to swallow some pride, example, swearing allegiance to the monarch in order to get in to do well in life? I presume those who became police constables, but they've had to swear an oath.
I'm not sure about that, but certainly to become something like a member of parliament or a lawyer, you would have. And I don't know, you just cross your fingers behind your back, don't you? Isn't that the usual procedure? But in terms of the police constables, frequently people say, oh, well, they've gone to the other side, but they haven't. They've actually accepted responsibility for running their own community and not sat back and let them send in somebody external who might in fact be a lot more draconian and a lot more difficult than one from the community themselves. So I kind of think, well, you can't really say Michael Dwyer was a turncoat because he became a constable. He's actually, in my view, you could say that he was stepping up to shoulder the responsibility for his own people and his own community.
I have from Roisin McClaverty. I'm currently reading the Catalpa Rescue by Peter Fitzsimmons, a brilliant book on the famous prison break in Australian and Irish history. Was there any other famous Irish prison breaks in Australia?
Yeah, I didn't have time to go into every single detail, but yeah, certainly the Young Islanders almost all managed to escape from Tasmania, Mitchell and Mara and co. But not a mass breakout as such. That would be more like an individual person managing to get onto a ship and get somewhere else. The Catalpa was a very famous one, and in fact, I was in the US a couple of years ago and wasn't even thinking about the Catalpa, and went to a town in Connecticut, and it was in the visitor center and chatting away to the lady. And said, "Oh, you're from Australia?" I said, "Oh, we've got a very famous grave in the cemetery. It's actually just opposite my uncle's grave." And I said, "Oh, who's that?" And she said, "Oh, it's Captain Anthony." The Captain Anthony was the captain of the Catalpa, so of course I had to rush off to the cemetery and find Captain Anthony. And I know in America they have that custom of putting little national flags next to the graves, and particularly if they're servicemen or something. And I thought, how will I find Captain Anthony in this cemetery? And of course his was the only grave that had an Irish flag next to it. And there he is, and it actually says on his gravestone, Captain of the Catalpa. So yes,
great.
it's very famous. There's been a heap of books. There's lots of songs. The Catalpa rescue was really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I remember there's the escape of John Hoare. That escape sort of led to the Rum Rebellion. Am I correct?
Which was that? Sorry, Colin.
The escape of John Hoare in 1807, I believe. I think wasn't Macquarie somewhat blamed, and it led to the Rum Rebellion anyway down the line.
No. Not quite. No, John Hoare. Yes, you're right. But the real thing that happened the Rum Rebellion was a complicated thing. But the victim of that was not Governor Macquarie, because he was a couple of years later. It was my best friend, Governor William Bligh, whose other famous claim to fame in history was the mutiny on the Bounty. So he doesn't seem to have had a very good record with mutinies. Yeah, but there were a number of things. One of them was also, as I mentioned, the trial of Dwyer and him saying, "Oh, well, that's not good enough. I don't like that court verdict. I'm going to have another court over here, and that court will have a different verdict according to what I tell them to do." So that was actually very well resented by the New South Wales court, because they had been the judges in the first case who had said that Dwyer was not guilty. So that was part of the reason for overthrowing Governor Bligh. But it was a complicated story, as many of these things are.
Yeah, that's such an interesting story. Like, having looked at a lot of the Irish that went out, especially the 1800s to 1806 period, like, fascinating stories. Like, it's we don't know much about them when we look into their stories in Ireland, because there's not much record there, but unless there's stories passed down and so forth. Or but the lives they lived in Australia, a lot of hardship, especially in the early 19th century for them. It's a fascinating story, and it's only, like, I lived in Australia 10 years ago, and to be quite honest with you, I knew very little of the Irish Australian story. I knew what a lot of Irish people think. Oh, a lot of Irish went out as convicts. We sort of forget that a lot went out as settlers as well. Thankfully, this lecture is broadened our minds a lot. You know, we focus on, we think a lot of America when we think of the diaspora and to Britain. We think very little about Australia. It is great to have this lecture and to educate us more on the Irish influence in Australia. And we thank you so much for getting up early in the morning to educate us on this and to give us such a great insight on this topic, and especially on that memorial. I used to visit that memorial often when I lived in Sydney, and it's great that you're after giving us the history of it now, and it's great to see it cleaned up as well. It was,
thanks, Colin. It's been a pleasure. For all that I had to get up a little bit earlier, and I'm going to go away now and have a cup of coffee.
Yeah, you deserve that. No, thanks very much, Anne-Maree, and thanks from all of us here at Traston and Atira, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. We had a great crowd in tonight. We had about 80 people, and that's fantastic. And we hope to see you all again for future Traston and Atira lectures.